So let's dig into the Unity interface so you can get a better understanding of where things are and what they do. So here's the layout that I showed you how to create in the last video. So the way that the Unity interface is broken down is, well, let's do this. Let's start by making an object. So up here is our scene view. This is the world, right, that we're going to build inside of. And next to it is the hierarchy view. And essentially, these are the same view. This is the same thing, but one is a visual representation and one is a list. So for example, it's called the sample scene. It's got a scene that's in here. When all we have is a scenes folder with a scene in it. I'll show you how to make one of these pretty soon. Up here, you can see it says sample scene and it's got a little arrow. And if I open it up, it will show me the contents of the scene. And right now there's a main camera and a directional light. So I'm gonna click on the camera and you'll notice that an item selects in the main view. That's the main camera. If I click away from it on nothing, it'll deselect it. Same thing over here. We'll deselect the object. If I click it here, it highlights it over here. So these two things are the same. And in most cases, you can do work in either window. And sometimes it's easier to deal with it visually, and sometimes it's easier to deal with it in a list. On the far right here is our inspector, and what this shows us is information related to whatever item we have selected. So I've got the camera selected, and over here it has a transform, and this indicates where it is in the world, right? So I could actually, for example, change a value, and it will move around in the world. X, Y, and Z position, rotation, and scale, called the transform. Can move it up and down, can move it forward and back. It also has a camera component. So these items attached to it are called components, and you can basically put any kind of components on any object and give them functionality. So this has the camera component on it, and that allows it to do things like, see this skybox that's in the background, but you could change it from skybox to solid color, and then it would show whatever solid color you picked here in this window. You can go back to Skybox if you want to. You can change the field of view wider or narrower. It doesn't do too much. That's the basic idea. The simplest idea is that these two windows are essentially the two different ways to access the world you're building, and that this window on the right, the inspector, gives you the detailed information about the item that you're currently manipulating or selecting at the time. If we wanted to make a new object in here, Unity doesn't have a lot of built-in objects. Most of that is stuff that you would bring in from other programs. But if you right-click over here, you can choose Create down to 3D Object. We've got basic also functions like cut, copy, and paste, which work just like you'd expect them to. But you can go to 3D Object and create a plane. And now we have a flat plane that's in our world, and you can see it's here. It's called plane. We could rename it if we wanted to, like if it was going to be the floor, we could call it the floor. You could just slow double click, I guess that's what it's called, and you can rename it again. Also, when you select it, it gives you information about it, and it shows what things make up a floor or a plane, right? So again, a transform, it needs to know where it is in the world. Basically, anything that goes in this scene has to have a transform. It's got a mesh that is the sort of detail of the surface. It's got a mesh renderer, so this component draws the mesh that's there, and you can actually turn it on and turn it off, and you can actually see the underlying mesh geometry, and we can choose to draw it, to have the camera see it or not. And then down here there's the mesh collider, which you would use for physics purposes. So every one of these objects has a different set of components on it that give it its own qualities on here. Okay. So you could create another 3D object like, let's say we're going to make a cube here. If you want to be closer to an object, then you can zoom in, zoom out. So let's talk about navigation a little bit. If you use your mouse wheel or the sort of 2-finger zoom on your laptop, then you can zoom in and get closer to this. If you hold down the Alt button, the Alt key on your keyboard, you'll notice that this little changes up here to an eyeball. And if you hold on Alt and click and drag, then you essentially what's called orbiting your view around the middle of your scene. Right? And then if you hold on Alt and you click and drag with the middle mouse button, you pan your scene. Right? So mouse wheel or 2-finger zoom on your keyboard to zoom, Alt left mouse button to orbit, Alt middle mouse button to pan. You won't pan, I don't pan all that often. I'd probably use the others a ton more. And that's how you get around to be able to look at it. Perspective can play tricks on you, so it's always good to be able to do things and look around and see what you're doing. You also might notice that this cube has this sort of highlight, and when I click on these different objects, they get these sort of what we would call handles, and these allow us to manipulate the object and put it in different places in the world. We can use these positional information here in the transform, and that's basically the same as clicking and dragging on this handle, right? So position X, red is X, Y is up and down, and Z is front and back. And a good way to remember that is XYZ equals RGB is one way. I don't know if it's easy, but it's a way that you can recognize it. Remember. So you'll notice that as I move the camera, we immediately see our scene update as our perspective on the world changes. If we wanted this cube, like right now, this cube, if I hold Alt and click and drag, you can see that this cube is sticking through the floor. And I can't even see the floor from the bottom, and that's because by default in Unity, objects only have one side that gets drawn by the camera. This is to save processing power. So it's there, we just can't see it from that side. So if I wanted this to sit more on the floor, then what I would do is select it either here or here. I would use my middle mouse button to zoom in maybe a little bit closer to see what was going on. And then I could click and drag and pull this up until it's sitting on top. Now, what if you wanted to zoom all the way back out? You could definitely use the mouse wheel to do that. But one of my favorite features is what's called the frame or fit command. So if I wanted to zoom out and make sure that I could see everything out to my floor, the edges of my floor, I could actually click the floor here or here and hit F, and it actually pulls my camera back to fit that object in the view so I can see the whole thing on the screen. If I clicked the cube and I hit F, that would also be a fast way to zoom in on it. And as you're working, this will be a constant thing that you'll be doing, rotating to look at your world at different angles, moving objects around, hitting F maybe to zoom in, right? And I think if I don't have anything selected, oh, it doesn't do anything. You can also shift select and it will take advantage of that. So this takes a little bit of practice, and I would recommend taking a little bit of time to do that. The last thing I wanted to show you as an initial is the idea of a scene, right? So we have a scene here called the sample scene, and we made some changes to it. So you want to make sure and save it. I'm going to go File, Save. So you got to save that. If I were to exit this scene or open a different scene, it would probably ask me if I wanted to save. If I want to make a new scene, I can go to File, New Scene, and it will ask me what time, and I can do a basic built-in is fine, and I'll click Create. And I've made it, but it isn't saved yet. So you'll notice that nothing new has saved down here. So I'm going to go, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save as, and I'm going to call it maybe just My New Scene. And here it's showing me the folder that it wants to go into. So all the things that you make will always go into the Assets folder. If I clicked Save right now, I'm just going to click Save right now. And you can see it saved it, but it's actually not in the Scenes folder. It saved it in the main Assets folder. If I wanted to, I could have saved it into the Scenes folder. You can also reorganize whenever you want by clicking and dragging. So I'm just going to click and drag that. You get a little highlight, and now all my scenes are in the folder. And in general, I tend to organize my stuff. You know, if I bring in 3D models, I'll have a models folder. I'll have a textures folder. I'll have a scenes folder, an animations folder. So now my new scene, here it is. I'm going to add a sphere in it just to make it a little bit different, right? And then make sure you save. If I want to go back to my original scene, just double click, and it loads that original scene up. Double click here, it goes back. So one thing also to remember here, we talked about these two, the hierarchy and the scene view are your views into the world you're building, and that's where you work. The game view is what your camera sees. So here we have the camera. I showed you if you move it closer, you see it gets bigger in your view. When you open this, it's probably set to a free aspect ratio, which is basically however wide this window is. If you want something that's more specific, you can go to this menu and, for example, choose 16 by 9, which would be similar to many monitors, for example. And you could go to 4K. They have different resolutions. You can also make your own if you want to. I tend to work in something close to 6 by 9 most of the time. So this is essentially the output of everything that we see here, and this is what your goal is. Like if you're making a movie, this is the movie down here. This is the view of the video game, and this is how we build it. The last window we haven't really talked about much is the project window. So our scenes are here, right? And again, if we were to bring in an asset, so if I wanted to import a model, for example, I could right click and say import new asset. And I'll go to, I'm sure I have a bunch of assets laying around. So here's a motion capture file, for example. So I'm going to import this motion capture file. And it comes in, and there it is as an item in my project. If I want a new folder, I can right click and say create folder, and then I could put it in there, give it a new name, right? So I could call this mocap data. Anything that I bring in, I can click and drag and put into the world, and it will show up. So now that item has been put into this scene, and I can then select it, use my handles, move it up, and then don't forget to save. Okay, so that's primarily the basics of Windows and what their functions are, and a little bit of an intro to how to manipulate objects in the world, how to manipulate things. Probably the only things I didn't show you in terms of manipulation, the other primary tools are, we looked at the Move tool, which is right here. The one to the left, these are your view tools. The Rotate tool, which doesn't show much if it's a sphere, but if we select our character here and we go to the Rotate tool, we can then rotate our object, different angles. Move them around. And then you can always hit undo. The Scale tool lets you scale your objects larger or smaller. If you click on one of the three colored ones, it will scale it only in that direction, which is usually not what you want to do most of the time. Sometimes with a plane, if you want to stretch it out a little bit, but there's not many other things that you want to do that with, or a cube maybe, right? Most of the time you want to go right in the middle, which scales all three directions proportionally. So now we can do that. Maybe go back to our Move tool, click and drag, and have it stand right on top of that sphere, right? And so then I'm holding Alt to click and pan, and then I'm holding my middle mouse button to pan, get my camera situated. So this takes practice. So I would recommend make a scene, throw some stuff in, move it around, try to take a look at it. If your view gets really weird and you don't know where you are, you can try, for example, clicking on something and saying F, but what if you can't see anything? What if you're like this? A couple things. Number one is you can select an object over here and hit, and then move your mouse back into this window, hit F, and it will frame it. The other thing you can do is that this little thing in the upper right-hand corner is a view manipulator, and you can click, for example, in the middle part, you can click the arrows to bring you back, and you can look at it from the top, the front, the side, right? So let's go maybe from the front, and then you could select Avery, and you could hit F and zoom out. Then we could go back to rotating again. The middle part actually switches between perspective and orthographic. So you can see how there's sort of a foreshortening. We're in perspective, which is probably what you'll use most of the time. But sometimes you want orthographic mode so that there isn't any perspective to help out, which can help things line up a little bit better. Particularly from the right and the front, if you're trying to line up two objects together, it can be a little bit hard to tell, right? So as a way of example, this is perspective. And I'm going to move this over here so that they're not right on top of each other. And let's say that I wanted to align them from this view, and I am in perspective. So in perspective, I come down, just want them to sort of line up. They're not lined up. This is still way above it because I'm looking at it there's perspective involved. But if I hit this, it will remove perspective. And we can see that this is vertically higher than this. Now I can drag it down. And now, if we actually look, you'll see that this level in 3D is the same. So you'll be in perspective most of the time, but every once in a while you want to be in perspective or in an orthographic view. Okay, that's the basics of getting around in the interface. In the next one, I'll talk a little bit more about how to use cameras and lighting.